Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser.
Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. After the recession ended in 2009, St. Louis firms began to hire. Almost 20,000 jobs were created in the first 18 months of the recovery. But by the spring of 2011, the St. Louis recovery stalled. Within the next 12 months, the area lost about 4,000 jobs, while other regions continued to add jobs. It was around this time that we on this program heard a new idea. The idea was this: move containerized freight from the Gulf of Mexico up the Mississippi River to St. Louis and distribute that freight from St. Louis to the Midwest via truck, train, and plane. Lots of new companies and jobs will be created, igniting an explosion of business activity. The idea has knocked around for more than 3 years. Excuse me. Finally, the St. Louis region is getting serious. Our guest today is Mary Lamie, Executive Director of the relatively new St. Louis Regional Freightway. The last time we met, she was the IDOT Region 5 Deputy Director of Highways. Now under the umbrella of Bi-State Development Agency and the Leadership Council Southwestern Illinois, Ms. Lamie has been directed to develop and implement a freight marketing plan that promotes the St. Louis region as a premier Midwest distribution hub to regional, national, and international business investors. In this half hour, we'll be discussing a relatively new idea for expanding business activity in St. Louis and in Metro East. Mary Lamie, welcome to Conversation. Excuse me. Did I get that relatively straight as to what it is you're trying to accomplish?
You did, and another one of our responsibilities is putting together a needs analysis and freight development plan, which will identify freight-related multimodal transportation projects that we want to help advocate for funding.
When you say for funding, are you talking government therefore? That sounds kind of government-y.
It is,
when I
yeah.
hear funding.
We've got
as opposed to
nationally
business.
significant projects that play a key role with our freight network, and then other projects that we want to help our municipalities and our counties and our leaders compete for local, state, and federal dollars.
Okay. So you've got this new position. What are you doing? What is it you're trying to actually accomplish yourself?
We've been really busy. What our goals are is we want to help the St. Louis region better take advantage of the anticipated 60% growth in the freight industry that's anticipated over the next 20 years for the entire nation. A lot of our peer cities like Nashville, Kansas City, Memphis, Ohio, or Columbus, Ohio, their growth rate as it relates to the freight industry has been higher than our region. And it's because they've been done a better job of planning and marketing for those regions. So those are the two primary goals that we have.
Yeah, I'm aware Columbus is really, that's a big trucking hub right there, and they've spent a lot of time and energy making sure that it is. So first of all, is this idea that I described about moving freight up the Mississippi, is that actually happening, or just we hope it will?
As far as container on barge, that's the plan where there's a lot of studies, and we've indicated there's a tremendous amount of capacity on the Mississippi River that can help accommodate it. With the expansions of the Panama Canal, where they're going to be making that canal deeper and wider, they're going to be able to move more product on the ocean carriers. And by doing that, we feel that we're going to be able to move a lot of those containers up and down the Mississippi River and take advantage of that growth. For the St. Louis region, we are strategically located on the Mississippi River. We are south of the lock and dams, and as most people know, the lock and dams act as traffic signals for the barge industry, so it increases or it adds additional time, and time is money. So we are south of all of those lock and dams, and then we are also ice-free for the barge traffic moving from our region to the Gulf of Mexico. And so that's a significant factor when you're trying to determine your time and your cost. And so for the St. Louis region, we offer a lot as far as the potential for container on barge. We have several locations within our region which are ideal, and to do that you need to have a facility where you can move product on and off the Mississippi River using the Class 1 railroads in the trucking industry and the barge industry, and we've got available land that we feel that we can help support container on barge.
Right, you said a lot there, and so I want to cover some of that a little bit slower. First thing, do we have the port facilities that are capable of handling that much containerized traffic?
There are actually a couple locations. One that comes to mind is American Central Port in Granite City. They have just finished their South Harbor. That facility has the capability and the equipment right now to actually move containers from barge to truck or barge to rail. They also have the available land. Typically you would need a shipper who is going to purchase about 1,000 containers, and they need to store those containers within that facility so they have flexibility to move product in and out, and those containers leave, and sometimes they don't come back for a very long time. And so American Central Port is a location that is ready to go for container on barge. We have several other locations that could be considered. We would have to do some additional planning and making some improvements, but we're an ideal location for it.
Now, are you focused only on the Illinois side, or are you focused on the Missouri side as well?
Our boundaries, we are a bi-state entity. I'm actually an employee of bi-state development, and so the counties that I represent, we have 5 on the Missouri side, City of St. Louis County, Franklin County, Jefferson County, St. Charles County, and then on the Illinois side, we include Madison, St. Clair, and Monroe County. And I'd mentioned that I'm an employee of bi-state development. When the discussions were taking place for my office and what entity would be responsible for it, bi-state development was selected because of their interstate compact ability, which basically gives them the authority to design, build, and collect revenue streams and basically run a facility within those 5 counties. So we can cross city lines, county lines, and state lines.
And so you wouldn't have to create like another entity that had that same license.
Correct. We're a governmental entity, and again, we've got that ability to provide those services within those 8 counties.
All right, so now what about on the St. Louis side right now? Do they have the facilities, like there is a Port of St. Louis, do they have the facilities right now for handling any containerized or enough containerized to make it worthwhile to use that side?
There are some locations that can handle container on barge. We would have to do some more homework as far as making sure they got the right cranes available to move that type of product. And then we would have to do some additional studies to make sure that we select locations that have sufficient space for those containers. And then there's also a port in Jefferson County, Missouri, and they're still in the initial phases, but they've got 2 potential locations that would have enough space and the right port access to the river that's something that they are certainly considering as well.
I heard about that years ago, I mean many years ago, that they were considering building there, and at the time I thought, well gosh, is that going to create even too much capacity? Is it going to push some of these ports out of business?
Our growth rate as it relates to the barge industry, we have not hit a saturation point. And what's happened within our region within the last 10 to 15 years, those large shippers like ADM, Kinder Morgan have recognized what that competitive edge is in our region when we're moving coal, agricultural materials, fertilizer, steel. They've recognized that we have a competitive edge, and that's where all of those national and global companies are recognizing our strengths in this region, and they're continuing to grow and operate.
Right. Now, most people can visualize what a container is. Most people have seen barges running up, that live in the St. Louis region, have seen barges running up and down the Mississippi River. But now explain to them, okay, so the barge, the traffic comes through the Panama Canal, comes to New Orleans, they offload some of these containers, they get put on barges, they come up to St. Louis, now what?
And then as it comes to the St. Louis area, you would be able to have those barges with those containers basically park at one of the ports. We would have very large cranes that are able to move those containers from the barge onto a truck or from a barge onto freight rail. And that's where, for our region, we've got great interstate access, which makes it very easy for the trucking industry to get to a lot of the major cities that we have in the Midwest in a one-day drive, like Chicago, Memphis, Kansas City. And then you also have the ability to put those containers on freight rail. We've got 6 of the Class 1 railroads operating in this area. Those are basically the national rail carriers in our area. And what that basically means is once you put those containers on freight rail, you have access to just about anywhere in the nation. So you don't have to worry about going to another region and switching it. And again, by having that, it's very cost effective to move your product from barge to truck and from barge to rail.
Now, as I understand it, the whole concept here of bringing stuff to St. Louis area for distribution is that it's less expensive to transport up the river, and then less expensive, therefore, to distribute within this region of, that you were just discussing by truck, in particular by truck, to the Midwest, than bringing it from the East Coast or the West Coast into our region. Is that?
It's correct, but what we need to focus on is we need to identify what type of product can withstand that additional time on the barge traffic. So when it's moving on the barge versus rail or truck, it takes additional time. And sometimes it can take as much as 2 additional weeks. And so what we need to do is identify what type of product can withstand that additional time. Things that we're considering would be furniture, appliances, things that are not time dependent, like cell phones.
Canned goods.
Canned goods, exactly. Or also working with those big shippers and finding out when they're shipping holiday supplies, like Christmas decorations. If that's being shipped during the months of February and March, they can likely withstand that additional travel time. If it's very time dependent, it's probably not going to be a good fit. And so that's one of the things that we're doing currently, is working with those big shippers like Home Depot, Kohl's, and Walmart, and Amazon.coms, and finding out what type of product would be suitable, and then more importantly, letting them know about the multimodal assets that we have in this area and our competitive edge for them to consider.
So you're really trying to get St. Louis to integrate itself into this business model of these large corporations.
That's correct. And to do that, we found through the study from East-West Gateway that our peer cities are actually out-marketing us. And for the last 5 to 10 years, they've done a really good job of letting the nation and at an international level know what those regions have from a multimodal perspective. And so we need to do the same thing. So some of the things we also want to focus on is we've got great national and global companies that are operating in this area. It may be as simple as just advertising those companies. We have Unilever, we have Hershey's, we have Procter & Gamble, we have Monsanto, we've got Bunge, we've got ADM, and we want others to know that they have selected this area. They're very successful, and they're doing very well from a revenue perspective. And that concept is kind of similar to where Walgreens moves into an intersection. Your competitor is constantly watching your next move. CVS generally follows. And that's where all of those great companies I mentioned, their competitors are constantly watching their next moves. We want to help others know that they have picked this region and that they should consider doing business in our region.
Mm-hmm. In addition to the bigger picture that you're just describing now, there's also all these suppliers that need to be created and actually hire people in order to support this new system that you're talking about, don't you?
Yeah, and another thing that we want to do is we want to do a better job of letting others, not only in our region, but a national level, who those suppliers are and the services that they provide. So if you're in California or New York and you're trying to consider where your next manufacturing or distribution center is, and you've got that entity who's figuring out that bottom line and that cost, we want to make sure that they are fully aware of all the services and entities that we have in this area. So when they do those cost comparison analysis, they have all that information.
Well, without asking for private information, I mean, how responsive have companies been to your entreaties so far? And I realize you're in the early stages, but how responsive have companies been?
They've been extremely responsive, and that's where, from their perspective, a lot of our initiatives are going to be focusing on advocating for infrastructure improvements like the Merchants Bridge, which is a freight rail bridge that crosses the Mississippi River. 6 of those national railroads cross the Merchants Bridge, as does the Amtrak. It's important to those different carriers that we continue to have good competitive costs in this area. To do that, we need to replace the Merchants Bridge. And so one of our initiatives is to identify those types of projects to help advocate for funding. The part that we're going to do a little bit different than the Departments of Transportation do, and that is they're generally identifying those projects and talking about the remaining level of service or the condition of it, and the fact that you need to resurfacing or replace the bridge. Our emphasis is not only going to be that, but we want to help justify those projects based on the support from the private sector and how those projects are going to help with economic development and helping that overall supply chain. And that supply chain is exactly what you mentioned, as far as trucks from 5 counties away are traveling to this area, bringing corn and soybeans. They're taking it to a facility like a Kinder Morgan or an ADM, who are then in turn providing a service, loading it to freight rail or to the barge industry. And then there's all these secondary entities that are included with that process. And so from the private sector, they're absolutely interested in improvements that are going to help keep their costs low. And then from the marketing perspective, anything that we're doing that can potentially help them increase additional clients and increase revenue opportunities, those initiatives are obviously of interest to them as well.
Now, as I recall, the Merchants Bridge, which the original one was built right around the turn of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
So it's aged,
Mm-hmm.
but it still functions,
Mm-hmm.
right? But that, as I recall, was built with private money.
Mm-hmm.
Is this rebuild that you're talking about going to also be private money?
It's going to be a public-private partnership where we're going to work closely with the private side and the public side and try and pool the dollars for that. We feel that that structure is unique from the perspective, the fact that it carries 6 of those national rail carriers and Amtrak. We think that's a good model to consider for public-private dollars. With the dollar amounts, we think we're going to be more successful when we work collaboratively and try and build the types of bring the types of dollars that we would need to replace that structure. The other benefit of it is once you replace that structure, right now there's 2 sets of tracks on the bridge, but only one is actually in operation. Once they replace it, you'll then have 2 tracks, which will then add additional capacity and redundancy.
As long as you're building, why not go for 3?
Well, I'm not quite sure if there's going to be enough space on that bridge as far as cantilevering that over. But right now, with the capacity that they've projected, 2 will do the trick as far as addressing some of those capacity issues that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always been an advocate. Overbuild. That's, when they built like Hoover Dam, they overbuilt that big time, but it's going to last for 2,000 years. When we built, the Merchants Bridge, that's been lasting for quite a number of decades. So, if you put a few more dollars in at the front, you're not going to have the next generation or the generation after that worry about it.
Right. Right now, they're focusing on 2 lanes,
Okay.
and that's based on the capacity and the demand that we have in the region.
So, one of the things that you have mentioned here again, so that people understand, our highway system, Interstate 70, 64, 55, and 44 are very important for distribution by truck. And so by bringing the cargo up the river to this spot, then it's easy to make that distribution because of St. Louis's central location in the interstate system. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and the benefit of having those 4 interstates in our region, we provide great access in a north-south direction and also in an east-west direction. As you mentioned, when you're moving product from one mode of transportation to another with an emphasis on trucking, the fact that we are centrally located in the Midwest, again, we're a 1-day truck drive to cities like Atlanta, Chicago, and Memphis, and Nashville, which is very important from a manufacturing or distribution center. That's another one of our initiatives where we want to help grow and expand manufacturing distribution centers in our region. And part of that selection process is your ability to regionally distribute product. And again, the fact that we're centrally located, it's an ideal location for distribution centers and manufacturing centers.
So it really becomes important that these highways be not just maintained, but upgraded as well over time.
That's correct.
Which,
and again,
which
part
we,
of our initiative is to better align economic development with the supply chain. And when we talk about economic development in the freight industry, we feel that one of the greatest opportunities from a growth perspective is really targeting on manufacturing warehouse facilities. And the key to our successes, as you mentioned, is our great interstate system, along with all of the other modes of transportation and that ability to have that flexibility to move product from one mode of transportation to the other, like you had mentioned with the barge and freight rail.
Now I noticed that also air is on the list. How big a portion? It doesn't seem to me that the kind of product you're moving is going to be, big in air.
We also feel that one of a great opportunity for growth in our region is through e-commerce. We have got a strong presence of UPS and FedEx. And as everyone knows, e-commerce seems to be changing on a monthly basis as far as their efficiencies and their ability to move product. The fact that we've got 5 airports in this region with an emphasis of Mid-America and Lambert, both of those airports are international cargo airports. we feel there's a great opportunity for growth with both of those airports as it relates to e-commerce, because most importantly, they have the available capacity on their airport, and they also have available land that is ripe for development. So both those locations, from a development perspective, they meet that top criteria for a major site selector as far as it's developable ready. You've got commercial real estate brokers who are representing it, the infrastructure is in place, great multimodal access to all the modes of transportation, and a great workforce surrounding both those locations. So from our perspective, it's a great growth opportunity. We want to help both Mid-America and Lambert better market those capabilities. As I'm working and building those relationships with the private sector, building that freight development plan and working on putting together that marketing plan, again, we want to promote those two locations and making sure everyone knows about that opportunity.
And you also mentioned pipelines in your, now what in the world has pipelines got to do with the distribution?
Pipelines have got a tremendous amount to do with the freight industry. We have the presence of Phillips 66 located in Wood River, Illinois. Their refinery is actually their largest refinery in the nation. They move a lot of their product to this area via pipeline, and then from there, a lot of times it goes to truck, and a lot of times it goes to barge. The important part of that is with that presence of Phillips 66 in Wood River, they're constantly changing how they're processing those fuels. And so that product will come here to this area in a form of crude. They'll process it and refine it. We'll leave it petroleum. But they also work very closely with the Port of New Orleans, with the refineries down in that area, and they're constantly communicating and changing how they process that, which leaves a great opportunity for us that we can continue those efforts and try and help them as far as letting them know about those opportunities we have from the barge industry and the trucking industry as it relates to pipeline. So it's an integral part for this region. We believe that that's one of our great strengths, having that pipeline presence.
I was surprised to learn that in the whole world, 65% of all pipelines are in the United States. Which is pretty incredible, because the next highest number is in Russia at 8% and Canada at all of 3%. So among those three countries, 76% of all the pipelines in the whole world are located.
And again, we've got one of the largest refineries located right in our region, and Phillips 66 picked this location way back when, because again, we are strategically located on the Mississippi River and in the center of the Midwest. And so we've got the other refineries that are operating along the coast, and that's why we are a strategic part of those discussions in transportation corridors because of our location in the Midwest.
Is that why our gas prices are relatively low here?
Oh, I'd like to think so. I don't know. I'll give credit to Phillips 66. But,
good. So then, let's see, railroads. We're going to go back to railroads here for a second. I remember a couple of decades ago, railroads really had a bad reputation. The lines were doing badly. They were falling apart. There was a lot of accidents. I believe that the railroad systems are now vastly improved over that. Is that true? And what is it like for the St. Louis region? What does our rail infrastructure look like?
I have met with most of our national freight carriers, rail carriers in this area. They have very high standards as far as safety. They're also working with the Federal Rail Association for the Positive Train Control Program, and so they've got a lot of projects in the works, and we're actually going to be helping them as far as funding opportunities for them to continue with those efforts. And as far as safety, that goes back again to the Merchants Bridge. And making sure that we're doing a good job of investing in our infrastructure, not just for our highways and our roads and our bridges, but also on freight rail. And again, that's one of those things, as you mentioned, sometimes that there may have been a negative perception, but I think more importantly, there wasn't just a lot of information out there and there wasn't a lot of interest. The interest now is, I think our region, along with the rest of the nation, is recognizing the benefit that the freight industry has from an economic development perspective, and for that reason, our rail carriers are getting a little bit more attention in this area, which is a great thing, and anything we can do to help with their initiatives from a safety perspective, that's one of the tasks that we absolutely want to focus on.
So we're down to less than 5 minutes now. And at this point, I always say, is there something that we haven't talked about that you want to talk about? So is there something that you wanted to add to this conversation that we haven't covered?
I think the biggest thing is the fact that we are strategically located in the Midwest. We've got a great multimodal transportation network, and we need to do a better job of letting others know what our capabilities are.
So it's marketing.
It's marketing, and the fact that, again, when we compare ourselves to our peer cities, they've been doing this marketing for the last 10 to 15 years, and their growth rate is much higher. We've got either comparable or better assets, and that's where we're expecting great things from this region. But to do that, we have to work at a bi-state perspective with all of these counties, both Missouri and Illinois, and more importantly, we've got to re-engage and work closer with the private industry in finding out what their needs are and better coordinating those efforts with the public sector.
Now, who is this competition, these peer cities? You've mentioned them a couple of times.
And I've been very careful to refer to them as our peer cities. And that's where I'm referring to Kansas City, Memphis, Nashville, Columbus, Atlanta, and I'm referring to them as our peer cities. At times they are our competitors, but other times we have to work closely with them as our peers, and that's where we need to collaborate with them in identifying what type of infrastructure improvements do we need to do to the Midwest, not just Missouri and Illinois, but those adjacent states, and then work at a national level as far as allowing us to better compete for federal and state dollars for the entire Midwest. So at times they're a competition, but when we're having those discussions about the next transportation corridors as it relates to the Panama Canal, whether it's going to go through the Midwest or those big ocean shippers going to end up going to the ports out east, that's where we need to work closely with those peer cities and collaborate, and then work at a national level to let others know what our capabilities are. And this region is the Midwest is a great location to invest in your infrastructure, and your rate of return from manufacturing, distribution, and the economy is going to be a good investment.
Of course, you have to work through government. I can tell that's a big component here. How much understanding have you found in those who are involved in decision-making areas of government as to what you're talking about and how important it is? Because they got millions of things coming at them and all kinds of proposals.
I would have to give credit to the creation of my office actually to government. They've recognized that in order for the St. Louis region to better take advantage of that increase in the freight industry, we have to do a better job of working with the private sector. As a result, the board at East West Gateway, which includes our county executives and our county board chairmen, it was through their leadership that recognized this is what we need to do. They're the ones who developed our office. And so from their perspective, each of them recognize at a regional level, we're going to be much more effective if we work closely together. They also recognize from an individual perspective, each of their individual counties are going to benefit if we excel in the freight industry. And then working at a state and a federal level, a lot of those programs that we compete for dollars, the transportation bill, it's called the FAST Act, Fixing America's Surface Transportation. They're now putting a lot of funding in there as it relates to the freight industry, and a lot of the criteria and the things that make a project eligible are exactly what we're working on. And that is, how does it impact your overall freight network?
That's a very good description. Thank you very much. We've about run out of time here. Thank you very much for coming and speaking with us today.
Thanks, Lee. I appreciate the opportunity.
You're very welcome. And for those of you who have been listening, I've been speaking to Mary Lamie. She's been describing a new idea for a freight district in the St. Louis region, which we're going to be working in collaboration with other cities throughout the Midwest. We're going to be uploading this program to YouTube so you can show it to other people. Thank you very much. See you next time.